and we were talking about the church, and he was just talking about perversion in this nation, and just how he had never seen anything like this before, and how perversion is going to be the great attack of the enemy, to try to take down the church, and as well as to take down our society. And I agree with him about the perversion, but I don't think it's going to come the way that he was describing, and the way that many of us believe that it's going to come. I've heard that it said that America's a perverted nation. I would certainly agree with that. But when we think about perversion, most of the time we think about sexual perversion. We think about, pedophilia. We lump in bestiality, homosexuality, the whole LGBTQ movement. We kind of think about, what's happening in sports with, transsexuals in sports, and all those kind of things that are just like have people just scratching their heads and trying to figure out really what's going on. The question of like, what's a man or what's really a woman? All of those things that seem like they were settled appear not to be settled. And that's where we look at perversion. But when you look at what the definition of perversion, the perversion is to alter or to change something from one purpose or one form to another purpose and to another form that may or may not be contradictory to the original purpose, that may or may not be contradictory, but is absolutely different. And so the great perversion that you're going to see that's happening even in the church is going to be something that is not moral, that is not a moral perversion. We make the mistake of trying to see the state of the world by the world. We judge it by the world. But the state of the world and the way we're able to see where we really are is when you look at the state of the church, when you begin to see the things that are going on in the church. And the great perversion is going to be in the church. The enemy is going to try to cause a great perversion in the church. You notice that there's a great falling away. There's not a great coming in, right? There's a great falling away. And that method that the enemy is going to use is called absorption. The enemy's going to try to absorb the church. When you look at destruction of the church, when you look at trying to break the church down, most of us see a dismantling of the church. But the truth of the matter is we look at what's going on. The world wants to use the church. So it wants to absorb the church. So what happens is with absorption, you allow an entity to keep its name, but the essence of that entity is totally different. And when the essence changes, it can no longer serve its original purpose, but it can serve a similar purpose. So it can serve a social purpose, but not a spiritual purpose. And the world can deal with a church that is social in nature and not spiritual in nature. When you take over the power structure, and when you begin to take over the management, and when you begin to reestablish new guidelines, you begin to make another entity that's guided by a totally different force in a completely different direction. There's another captain in the ship. So I want you to understand that there is a social church. Now, the Bible says this: upon this rock, I will build my church, and the gates of hell should not prevail against it. So we know that there's a remnant and there's a true church, but there is also a false church that's being built that looks like and mimics almost perfectly the true church, except in true love and in doctrine. That is going to be the difference. So the entity will continue as it is.